All right, let's start with the decision by the Harris campaign, by Kamala Harris, 26 days before the election, that they suddenly needed to start talking about what they intend to do for Black voters and for Black men in particular. It's like they kind of woke up after all these years, and Kamala Harris was like, oh, I guess we need to talk about Black men because there's signs that they're not actually going to stay in line and do what they're told and vote for me automatically, regardless of how I treat them. So they unveiled this, I forget exactly what they're calling it, agenda for Black men or opportunity for Black men. And it contained a bunch of planks of what they think Black men want to hear that they decided to announce and unveil less than a month before the election. What are your thoughts on that happening and the platform itself?
Yeah, I think it's just another insult from the Democratic Party. Their message to Black men essentially was, smoke some weed, invest in crypto, and shut up. And this is the general attitude of the Democratic Party. And you did a great intro explaining how Kamala Harris is blaming the dissent that Black people have regarding the neoliberal regime, the Zionist regime. They're blaming that on Russia. Apparently, the only reason I started Revolutionary Blackout and I speak out against the crimes of the Democratic Party, the reason why I speak out against cop cities, the reason why I speak out against the war crimes that they are committing in Gaza, them bombing Africa and their use of sanctions that impact 1/4 of the world's population. Apparently, according to them, Glenn, the only reason I'm upset is because Russia is brainwashing me. The insults that the Democratic Party commits against the Black people will make the Republicans envious, the same way they invited George Floyd to the White House only to make a bill to give his killers more money. The insults that whenever they want to talk to the Black community, they bring on a celebrity to shake their ass. They bring on
Oprah.
What's her name? The horse lady. Megan Thee Stallion, the horse lady, Oprah. And that's how they communicate with us. Apparently, there's no Black intellectuals. So we have two completely different approaches. We want to see policy that actually improve the status of the Black proletariat and prevent our Black labor from being exploited, not crypto nonsense, not trickle-down economics for the Black community. Liberals claim, Glenn, that they don't support trickle-down economics, but whenever they bring up anything with the Black community, they say, let's just give Black capitalists and Black business owners money, as if that's going to address the needs of the Black proletariat and the Black working class. The question we should be asking liberals is, what is the plan for the Black working class, the Black poor, the Black Americans that hold record amount of medical debt? They said they're having a health initiative. What's a health initiative? Are you solving the issue of medical debt that's plaguing our community? No. So that's the question that we've been asking, Glenn, is what is the real actual Black agenda? And they have none. What's poppin', my friends, my family? Welcome to another edition of RBN Live. Hope you are having a good one. Yesterday we had a very fun stream, a solo stream I did with an hour, and then I jumped on with Glenn Greenwald after that. So make sure you guys check that out. And of course, we have another banger. We have a guest that was very highly recommended by the RBN community, an anti-imperialist, scientific socialist, truth seeker, and educator. Welcome to RBN for the very first time, Joti Brar. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
And I see your bio and how you describe yourself, especially with the emphasis on anti-imperialist, and that piques my interest, scientific socialist. That's all what I'm about. And I wanted to ask you, for people who may not be aware, how will you define that? What does that entail? And why do you think it's so important for the left to embrace an anti-imperialist stance? In the Western left, we have seen an infestation of social democrats like Bernie Sanders, AOC, Mehdi Hasan, who their strategy is to sell out the global working class in order to get the illusion, I had to check myself, illusion of meager gains by the working for the working class. So what is your overall definition of that, and what do you think is the best path for the working class to take? Thank you for joining us again.
You know, Nick, that's really important, that word you said, illusion. You know, I live in Britain, and Britain was the first kind of thoroughgoing capitalist economy, and therefore it was the first imperialist economy with the biggest empire, the most dominant empire. And so it was the first capitalist class that was able to buy off its workers with loot from the rest of the world. And Marx and Engels in their works during the 19th century pointed to this phenomenon that after the defeat of the first revolutionary working class movement ever, which was the Chartist movement, was defeated in 1848 or soon after. But in the period following that, because British capital was stretching across the world and Britain was exporting manufactured goods to the entire world, and it basically had a monopoly on this, not just a small section of the British working class, but almost the entire working class for a period of about 20 years between sort of 1860 and 1880 were being bought off. And Marx and Engels looked at this situation and said, this is why socialism is dead in England at the moment, because the bribes are coming in from the empire. But of course, that situation couldn't and didn't last. And the same pact with the devil was also signed by workers in all the imperialist countries after World War II. We said, if you provide us with a welfare state that looks a little bit like what we would get if we had a socialist revolution, we will not ask you where the money is coming from, what you have to do to get it. Because the reality was, they presented it as if it was paid for through taxation. But the reality was that most of it was paid for through pushing down, tightening the screws on the people in the colonies. And that was a real pact with the devil. And once again, it was ephemeral. I mean, for many people, it felt like it was permanent. There's a whole generation that grew up with all the guarantees and the affluence that came with the welfare state, with having pensions and job security and housing and education and healthcare, all of these things, which we certainly had in Western Europe. But they're all being taken away. Under capitalism, these periods can only ever be temporary. Every gain you make is taken away from you as soon as you stop fighting. There's no permanent solution to working class poverty and immiseration under capitalism. So fundamentally, that's why I'm a socialist. And scientific socialism, which you mentioned earlier, is so important, because what Marxism is the science of socialism. Marx was a person, he didn't just have some ideas. The ruling class presents Marx to us as if he was just some guy from the Victorian era who had some ideas and wrote them down. And some of them are quite interesting, but you can get your ideas from anywhere you like. No, Marx was like Isaac Newton or Charles Darwin. Marx discovered actually existing laws about how history works, about how the productive forces under capitalism work, about where value comes from. What's the root of the wealth of the capitalist class? He showed these things, and in showing them, he also showed us, number one, how it is impossible to fix the problems of inequality and polarization that come with capitalist production for profit, how it's impossible to fix the problem of cyclical crises, and we're now in a period where crisis is kind of permanent and constantly deepening on a global scale. Marxism shows you how these things cannot be escaped while you have capitalism. That's the real power of it. It inexorably, the logic is there. Once you study capital, you can't unknow that stuff. That's why they do everything they can to stop you studying capital. They're always telling you how hard it is, because they don't want you to have the power of the knowledge that's in there. But Marxism also shows you that the forces are already existing within the shell of this old, dying, decaying society. The forces have already been created that are capable of taking us forward and creating the new society. It's not something we have to imagine out of our brains, let's fantasize about what the world should be like 10-year-olds do. And anyone who's had a 10-year-old knows that they love to do that, put the world to rights and fantasize about how they would make things nice for people. You know, scientific socialism, Marxism, shows us, reveals to us the forces which are already being built within this society, the huge productive forces which are run in cooperation. You know, huge numbers of people are engaged in making every product that we use comes to us as a result of this great collective effort and these huge factories and means of production. So these forces are already existing that can be harnessed to provide a good life for everybody. And the modern proletariat, the class which has no way of existing without selling its labor power to the exploiting class. This is the class of the future. It's the class that capitalism has produced, and it's the class that's going to go forward to build the new society, which is socialism. So it's why Marxists will say to you that the working class is the ruling class in waiting. And this is something we have to become conscious of. And when we become conscious of it, we're going to become truly dangerous. But the thing that we need in order to achieve our liberation is a knowledge of scientific socialism. So it's the working class's liberation ideology. It's absolutely indispensable. It's not a kind of professorial hobby to sit and read the works of Marx, Engels, Lenin. This is an activity that every class conscious worker should be engaged in.
Yeah, that was a absolutely beautiful explanation, and this is what I've been explaining on the channel, how Marxism is a science, and capitalism is not inevitable. People fall for capitalist realism, the ideology that this capitalist structure that we are living under will always be. What we know through scientific socialism is that as late-stage capitalism continues to develop, as the workers continue to be trained, as the tension continues to build, because the tension will build, it's a science, so the tension will build, and then the workers become radicalized, and then they are given a choice. And this is what we as Marxists and socialists try to avoid. They can go the path of fascism, which I think we are on right now. When you see people become radicalized, they accept the extension of capitalist government power and authoritarianism, or you can go the path of socialism and liberation and communism. And we've seen multiple societies often go the wrong path and wrong direction. We see CIA interventions. We see reactionaries toward shift societies toward fascism. What we are advocating is once the tension builds and once capitalism reached the boiling point that we advocate, we replace it with socialism. I saw you on mute. Was there anything you want to add to this? Anything you want to correct? Anything you want to add to this?
Just because it sounded like my son was walking into the room and I thought he might start speaking.
Anything you want to add before I move on?
Just on what you were saying, that absolutely, while socialism ultimately is inevitable, it is the next stage in human development, we won't get there automatically. We have to fight for it. And of course, the ruling class has it's a very tiny, in fact, number of people in whose interest this society is run and maintained. But they've created a huge machinery of repression. And a big part of that machinery of repression relies on mechanisms of dividing us so that we fight one another instead of getting together to fight them. And that's really, really important. But so we've been presented since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the East European socialist countries with this idea of capitalism as the end of history, the ultimate destination of humanity, the ultimate expression of human nature, which is such an insult to humankind, frankly. But, you know, we're told that capitalism represents a natural development of our nature, and therefore it's inevitable that we'll always have capitalism. Again, Marxism, with its revolutionary understanding of history, it's such a wonderful, liberating ideology because it puts capitalism in its place as just one of several phases of human development in between our primitive state, which was communistic, and our future state, which will once again be communistic. This period in between of class societies, exploiting societies where you have slave owners and slaves, feudal nobility and serfs, capitalists and wage slaves. These are development phases in human history which are leading us towards the point where we no longer have exploitation, no longer have classes. We return to a communistic society, but on a higher basis of all the technological and cultural and scientific achievements that we've achieved, in the period in between. So it's actually a wonderful time to be alive in many ways. We can be part of bringing about the end of exploitation for all of humanity. That is the task that now faces the world proletarians, the working class people of the world. It's a wonderful task to be given, because we're not just here to make a revolution that switches between one exploiting class and another. We get to make the revolution which ends exploitation for good. And that is a wonderful historic destiny to be tasked with. Just very quickly, you brought up the question of repression. And of course, because the ruling class is in crisis, because their system is increasingly untenable, they resort to fascistic naked terror to keep us down as our discontent is growing. Our discontent is growing because they're unable to bribe us in the way they used to. And huge numbers of people are being steadily and then rapidly impoverished as a result of the global crisis of overproduction that has been the inevitable outcome of capitalist production for profit. Because of that situation that they're in, they need repression to try to stay on top, just like they need war to try to bring back profitability to their system. And in Britain is what I can really talk about. We are seeing those moves, and something that's very interesting, I think, and probably plays into the discussion that you have regularly about the electoral system in the USA and Democrats v. Republicans and all of this. What I can say from my experience is the seemingly left-wing pro-worker government, which is actually just another face of the ruling class, that government is the one the ruling class prefers when it needs to bring in anti-worker measures. We have a new Labour government in this country. And as with previous Labour governments, it's been brought in particular to attack the working class in ways the Tories would not get away with, because it has the trade unions in its pocket. And the trade unions can be relied upon to say, don't rock the boat because we'll get the Tories in. And they hold this threat over us that means the workers feel that they have to put up with all the things that they hate that the government's doing. And right now, what we're seeing the government trying to do is change the legal system so that it can criminalize protest, dissent, in particular, the Palestine movement, which it's done a lot of targeting and harassing of people in that movement, including members of my party have been arrested, some of them on hate speech charges, because we're anti-Semitic when we complain about Zionism or tell the truth about Zionism. And the other one is on charges of supporting terrorism because we say victory to the Palestinian people and their resistance. And then they say, oh, but Hamas, that's supporting Hamas and Hamas is prescribed and you're terrorist supporters. So they've arrested our people, they've harassed them, they've made their lives very difficult. But ultimately they end up dropping the charges because they know that the system as it's currently constituted, it'll be very difficult to get convictions. If they won't be able to get juries to bring guilty verdicts on the basis of the evidence they've got, which is no evidence. And particularly when there's all this international law and international judgments that we can bring to explain, and back up everything we're saying. So what they need is a change in the legal system that means that they can just fast track people from arrest to jail without the inconvenience of a jury. So they've been trialing this summer the use of the kind of courts they used against the Irish national liberation fighters in the north of Ireland. They called them diplock courts. It's a court with one judge and no jury. And it's just a rubber stamping affair because the guy is, it doesn't matter what the evidence is, essentially. It's also, you speed up the process so the defendant doesn't even have a chance really to assemble a case or even necessarily get the right lawyer. They might just get the duty lawyer, who's in the police station, right? So they used the excuse of racist riots in the summer, which they incited. They wanted those riots to happen. And then our Prime Minister jumped up and said, oh, we need to get these nasty racists off the streets, don't we? And of course, everyone agrees with him because the majority of people in Britain are not racist. They don't sympathize with people, attacking asylum seekers. So they're like, oh, you want to get the racists off the streets quickly? Okay, then. But actually, the laws that they're bringing in and the way they're framing it against, harsher penalties for hate speech online, that they actually mean anti-Zionist speech. Quicker processing of people who are causing problems. They're not talking about the racist rioters that they incited. They're talking about the Palestine movement. They're talking about the anti-imperialist core of the Palestine movement, which is starting to get traction in this country. And the Labour Party, which usually has tight control of all protest movements, is not really in control of the anti-imperialist core of the Palestine solidarity movement. And it's definitely worrying our ruling class.
Yeah, now I see why you were such a highly recommended guest. Something that I love about that beautiful rant, I'm a rant enthusiast myself, was the revolutionary optimism that you talking about, like the task at hand and how it's a beautiful task. And that's the revolutionary optimism you guys get once you embrace Marxism. When you reject it, when you embrace reactionary ideologies implanted by the CIA, like social democracy, because you're implying that socialism is not democratic. That's why you call yourself a democratic socialist, because doing stuff for the workers, that can't be democratic. When you are a part of the Bernie Sanders left, you embrace a political nihilism, the nihilism of defeat. You see the task at hand, and you are filled with dread to the point where you will support genocide because you're so afraid. You will join a capitalist institution because you're so afraid. That's why I think revolutionary discipline and theory is so important, because it can also instill that nihilism in you and completely, because I can speak for experience, drain yourself of all liberalism. Because once I read State and Revolution, for example, like that's when the liberalism left the body. That's what happens, and that is when you install with optimism. So much more you added, and I wanted to ask you this, and I want to pick your brain on this a little bit more regarding the British left. I love what you said regarding the Labour Party, which is a disgusting organization. I don't know why anyone would consider it on the left. I remember seeing Jeremy Corbyn, who was a critic of the Zionist entity, and he was smeared and attacked by the Labour Party the same way you described. And I've seen many people in the chat in the United States will feel the same way, that when you were speaking about the UK, it felt very similar to our position in the United States, especially regarding the frightening political persecution of dissidents, because you explain how they're speeding up the court system to go after dissidents of the Zionist entity in the British Empire. That's the same thing we see with the Huru movement, where you have Chairman O'Malley, who was charged by the Biden administration. And you mentioned something that was very interesting as well, where in the UK they're struggling to do this, because how can you convince a jury to implement fascism? Which is interesting. I never thought about it like that. But when you look at the Huru trial, they was found by a jury of their peers innocent of the ridiculous charge that they was Russian state actors. This is a charge that if you read like Reuters talking about this, MSNBC, they will repeat it as if it's a fact. They're like, oh yeah, these people are charged with being Russian agents. Meanwhile, the average person was like, what are you talking about? And that's why they was found not guilty of the charge of being a Russian state actor. So Joti, I want to ask you, because what you said was very interesting to me, and we haven't really got to topics yet, but this is a very thought-provoking conversation, so I'm letting it go. I want to ask more about the UK love, because I'm looking at it outside in. I've been following it loosely for years. I saw Jeremy Corbyn taken down, and I wanted your perspective on him, because I don't know if he's perfect. I just know what I've seen from the outside in, and him being critical of the Zionist regime. But after that, I knew that the British left was completely cooked. And I'm seeing, and it's weird to say this because there's a lot of authoritarianism in the United States regarding their attacks on socialists and anti-imperialists. But I view, and I may be mistaken, and you can chime in on this as well, but I view it as more dire in the UK and in Germany in particular than the United States, which is strange to say, but is that accurate? Do you want to chime in on anything? Anything you want to add? What's your thoughts?
I think probably in many ways you may well be right. I just, if I may, I want to come back on your question about optimism, because I think it is something really important to get across to people, that if you study Marxism, you cannot but be optimistic about humanity and humanity's bright future, and even about, you know, the prospects of overcoming all the difficulties which are in our way from where we are to where we need to get to. It's all perfectly possible, and it gives you real faith in the working class. And I think the problem, you know, I always say to my comrades, have a daily study practice. And I don't mean reading. I don't mean reading lots of things that are interesting, right? Eclectic reading is all very well, but it doesn't do the job that you need it to do of really inculcating socialist science into your core in a way where it can't be shaken. So it's really important for revolutionaries to have a daily habit of studying, you know, 10, 20, 30, 40 minutes a day of a classic text, something by Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin in particular. And I call that a daily inoculation against the bourgeois propaganda that you're going to be overwhelmed with from every other direction. And what I've noticed many times in my life as an activist is when people drop the habit of regular study and replace it with just general reading or nothing, or following the news, or thinking that they know all their Marxism and don't have to keep it topped up, don't have to remind themselves of the principles and the, you know, the struggles of the past, what happens is they become very quickly pragmatic. Just what you were talking about the people in the Bernie Sanders campaign. And from pragmatic, you go to pessimistic. You become overwhelmed by the size of the task and the difficulty of the job in front of you. You become demoralized about what seems to be the weakness of the working class. You forget that it's part of your job to help the working class find its strength, which it has. It just doesn't know it has it, right? So the working class is very strong, but it needs to realize that, wake up to that, and learn how to organize and use that strength. But of course, we're presented with a mass of individuals who all seem kind of weak and uneducated and incapable. And, you know, that demoralization is not an accident, but it's easy to fall into that demoralized feelings and to end up actually distrustful and fearful of the working class, which is the ruling class's attitude, but it's also an attitude they push into us, you know. So I just wanted to come back on that a little bit. When you asked me about the British situation and the left here, we have this horrible situation where not only we have the original Social Democratic Party is the Labour Party. It never even was a socialist party. You know, in the rest of Europe, there were parties which started socialist and then at the time of World War I became social democratic. World War I revealed that they had become rotten, and they sided with their own ruling classes during that war. And we had this split in the working class movement between the revolutionaries and the social democrats. And this is what the Bolsheviks came out of, the revolutionary wing and the October Revolution and the Third International and all of that. The Labour Party in Britain, because of our particular status as the world's most, you know, advancedly corrupt working class, our Labour Party was always the party of the Labour aristocracy, the privileged section of the working class who got their privileges through the imperialist looting of the world. Labour never represented anything other than that section. It was always an imperialist party. We had the first Labour government in 1924 it was only 6-8 months it lasted, the first one, but its leaders openly said that their job or their goal was to show the ruling class that the empire was safe in their hands. That was 100 years ago. So the idea that we can get back to a better Labour Party than we have today, or that Labour kind of changed with Tony Blair or Keir Starmer, is all total nonsense. Labour has never, ever been a socialist party. There were years when, to fool ordinary workers because socialism was popular, they had a little clause in their program, Clause 4, it was famous, that said that a Labour government's aim was to nationalise the means of production and exchange, or something like that, distribution and exchange. No Labour government ever acted on that. That is not what Labour is for. But it was there as a kind of fig leaf. And Labour always would have 4 or 5 members of parliament whose job it was to tell everybody they were socialists. And they played the role, as Lenin called it, the role of the constantly outvoted minority. Right? They didn't have power. They were never going to have power. Their job is to persuade working class people that because they are in there, it's the place where socialists should be, that this is the workers' party, the working class party, that if you want socialism in Britain, you should work to bring the socialists to power within the Labour Party. Yes, right. It's exactly, it was always a lie. It was always a mirage. It was never possible, never, ever possible. My father has written books about this, the history of the Labour Party. Our party just recently republished the preface to that book that he wrote 30 years ago with a new introduction as a pamphlet called Britain's Perfidious Labour Party, to try, because this is a constant discussion you have to have with workers in Britain, that the Labour Party is not, has never been, can never be a vehicle for working class liberation. One of the reasons so many people are confused about that is because we have a whole plethora of self-identifying socialists and communists in Britain. Socialists, by which I mean basically Trotskyites, i.e. state agents, and revisionist communists, i.e. degenerate to the point where I don't even know what they are anymore. They're basically, but they're really what they all are is the left wing of social democracy. And what's interesting about all these groups is for all the ways in which they pretend to disagree with one another, in practice, they all work very happily together in cooperation. And the reason is their practical program is the same. It's vote Labour, support the Labour Party, prop up the left wing of Labour, and spend your time herding the working class back towards Labour when they start to be disgusted with Labour and move away. So this is the role that the vast majority of the British so-called left play. They play the role of amplifying and prettifying the Labour Party and excusing its crimes and telling everybody, well, it's better than the Tories. All lies which hold us back, stop us from understanding the reality, stop us from grasping the real, truth and organising what we need to do instead, tying workers to the Labour Party in 100 different ways. And because we don't do that, and because we expose what these people are up to and what charlatans they are, and how most of them are, in fact, in one way or another, supporters of imperialism, my party, the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist, it's a mouthful for, historic reasons, but my party is absolutely excluded from all of the broad left, which turns out not to be broad after all, because the broad left means if you will support left Labour, you're all right with us. And if you won't, you're excommunicated. And that, unfortunately, or fortunately, that's the position of my party.
It's wild because without context, if you didn't hear my question, if you ignored the specific names you was using, you could easily made the conclusion that you was talking about the United States left. And that's why, as revolutionaries, we are facing a unique task that no other working class ever had, because we have an interconnected empire. And I don't know the best term, but we have essentially the NATO alliance, the NATO imperialist alliance as a whole to overthrow. We have the United States, the UK, Germany, France. They serve as one entire imperialist system, which is why these conversations, connecting with other international leftists, is so important. Because I think we have a ruling class, the likes that working class people never seen before, where they are literally exchanging strategies. So when I hear you talk about this is why this is an enjoyable conversation, because I'm learning a lot as well. It's clear that the AOC, Bernie Sanders, and the Justice Democrats, they modeled their behavior after the British left in a blatant attempt to control the working class of the United States. And it's clear that this connection between how the UK operates, how the US operates, is not an accident. And we even seen with the Green Party, with Howie Hawkins, where he was supportive of the NATO proxy war. He was repeating COVID, capitalist authoritarian agendas. He was pushing Russiagate. And that's the same thing we've seen with the Green Party in the UK and in France and Germany, where the Green Party in Europe was refitted to be a neocon, liberal-friendly wing of the left in this country. And I saw it, and we've seen it in real time. It was very weird to see it, them attempt to bring that in the United States with Howie Hawkins, and we cut the head off that dragon. Like, we completely destroyed the Howie Hawkins wing of the Green Party. But there was an attempt to turn the Green Party to pro-NATO. That's why I'm glad that we at least have an anti-NATO, staunchly anti-Zionist Green Party now. But there was an attempt by the ruling class to install these pro-imperialist left. And that's the strongest force that we've seen of that is the AOC left, the people that will go on the DNC stage and lie on behalf of the genocidal Biden administration, saying that they are working on the ceasefire. And with that said, I want to transition as we get to the last half of the show here. I want to get your thoughts on what I've been describing as the genocidal psychosis of the West. I guess you can make the argument that it's always been there with the Native Americans, the massive killings and lynchings of African Americans and the Jim Crow era, between how they always treated Palestinians. But I made the personal observation that this generation of the ruling class is completely rebelling against the rules that the previous ruling class have created. They are a complete rebellion of the Geneva Conventions, international law. So when you have peacekeepers, these international peacekeepers, do you guys understand that when they give the orders, the countries are supposed to follow? They are the peacekeepers, the UN international peacekeepers. And Israel is not only attacking and killing peacekeepers, they are literally attacking them with chemical weapons. They're launching chemical weapon assaults on UN peacekeepers while the world looks on and say, Israel, can you please stop? Let me read the tweet. Actually, let me read it just in case you guys was only listening. Here's a tweet I put up from the UNIFIL. Despite putting on protective masks, 15 peacekeepers suffered effects including skin irritation, gastrointestinal reactions, I believe that is, after the smoke entered the camp. The peacekeepers are receiving treatments, meaning Israel is gassing UN peacekeepers. In a response for the UN, after their own people was gassed, after their people was slaughtered by Israel, they have countless UN workers who was murdered. Their response is they have strong concern, and they are currently writing Israel a strongly written letter as we speak. So before I continue, I want to get your overall thoughts on Israel's barbaric actions, not only just against the peacekeepers, but your thoughts on their genocidal siege as a whole before I continue.
Thanks, Nick. You know, you said at the beginning, and I think it's absolutely right, the history of capitalism and imperialism is one long string of genocides. This, in fact, is nothing new. There is nothing new about what's being done in Gaza. In the history of Palestine, it's been ongoing for 75 years. In the history of capitalism, imperialism, there's been genocide after genocide after genocide. Genocides of African slaves, genocides of Indian peasants, genocides of Korean workers. Just go around the world and point to a spot and someone can tell you the genocide that happened there. Indonesian communists, Brazilian communists, Chilean communists, Russian workers and communists in World War II, Chinese communists under the Japanese fascist occupation. The list of genocides of the 20th century is enormous, never mind the whole 400 years of capitalist plunder around the globe. I think the thing that's shocking people right now is the way that in the 20th century, and particularly after World War II, when, because of the particular situation where socialism globally was on the march forward and the imperialists were on the back foot, and from that moment, the imperialists morally had lost all the arguments, and they had to wrap themselves up in the words of socialism and the progressive people of the world. So they had to pretend to be in favor of women's rights, against racism, in favor of the rights of nations to self-determination. They're not in favor of any of those things. But these demands had become so all-encompassingly popular in the world after World War II, because of the Soviet Union in particular, and because of the surge of national liberations that the October Revolution had ultimately inspired. The world balance of forces had changed to such a degree that the imperialists could no longer maintain their position whilst openly stating their goals and aims and methods and tactics. So they had, in fact, it's a sign of their weakness that they have to pretend to be in favor of all these things that they're not in favor of, because of course we're constantly seeing their hypocrisy exposed, and that's a weakness for them, that they say one thing and do another. It fundamentally undermines their position. But the genocides that the USA in particular, but also Britain, France in Algeria, have overseen since World War II, have tended to be hidden from the Western populations. Now, while they controlled all of the media, except for a tiny number of, working class newspapers, this was relatively possible for the ruling class to maintain their kind of stifling hold on the information. And the majority of workers in the West never really understood or had any suspicion about the crimes that were being committed by their governments and their government's armies and their government's proxy forces in the oppressed countries. They didn't see it. They didn't understand it. They didn't know it. And when news would finally start to filter through, it was always a long time after the fact. So it could always be presented like it was a shock to everybody, and like, oh, well, that's how we used to do things, but now we're civilized. Oh, there were horrible crimes committed, and a government could apologize for something a different government did 30 years ago, and all the members of that government are dead, and so there was always that kind of time lag between a crime being committed and the people starting to find out about it, and a way of presenting it like all the crimes were always in the past. I think the big shock for people with the genocide escalation in Gaza in particular right now, but actually it's fanning out across the Middle East now, isn't it? But what we've been seeing for the last year in Gaza in particular has shocked so many people in the West, because for the first time, large numbers of people are plugged into information sources that give the lie to what the leaders of their countries and the politicians and the media are telling them minute by minute. You've got the evidence in front of your eyes. And then right next to it, you have the topical speeches of your leaders who are lying about things that they cannot but know about. If you know about it, their government knows about it, right? And they're trying to tell you the opposite, that you can't see what you can see. They're pretending to care. They're pretending to do something, but very clearly not doing anything. In fact, the opposite of not doing anything, they're fueling this situation. They're sending weapons every single day to this regime that the UN's gone, yeah, we're pretty sure that you have to say this is genocide and you should definitely stop. And then we see, on top of that, now we come to the question of the United Nations. many of your viewers will know that my father is a very eminent scientific socialist, a Marxist activist who's been writing, studying, and active in the movement for 60 years. So I often quote him, and I don't really apologize for doing that, because, you know, it's not just because he's my dad, right? He's my party's founder and a great leader in our country. And he, for many years, characterized the United Nations as the imperial office of the United States of America. It's situated in New York, the main funder. So they physically control who can come there and who can't. They can physically harass, monitor, follow, and dog the footsteps of every single representative who works there from another country, and make their lives difficult, and put pressure on them, and get compromise on them, and tempt them, and try to turn them, and, you know, manipulate them in all kinds of ways. They are the main funders of the United Nations. And of course, they are the ones with this crucial veto. Something the United Nations does or doesn't do is entirely up to the say-so of the USA. So the whole of the United Nations says Israel's racist, Israel's apartheid, Israel's committing crimes, war crimes, Israel's committing genocide. And the USA goes, yeah, but we're not going to do anything about it. And nothing can be done. And so the whole United Nations system, this whole concept that there's a real meaningful international body, that is itself being blown out of the water by what's happening in front of us. Now, what's interesting about UN peacekeepers is, of course, in reality, UN peacekeepers are only in places where the USA has approved them being sent. So they're not really an international body. They're actually proxy troops for the USA. They're just kind of one remove. You only have to look at Haiti to see the reality of that. These are US imperial troops in other countries' uniforms, and the body bags go back to other countries if they suffer. But in the case of the UNIFIL force in Lebanon, being, you know, this peacekeeping force is there really to protect Israel, actually, but Israel suddenly decided that they're in their way, and because Israel knows that Israel is the USA's rabid attack dog in the Middle East, and Israel knows that whatever it does, the USA will back it up, and it knows that therefore the USA, the United Nations, is toothless. Its leaders constantly scoff at the United Nations and thumb their nose at it, because they know it doesn't matter how many resolutions the General Assembly passes against Israel and Zionism and apartheid and war crimes and genocide. It's going to carry on because the USA has its back, and the United Nations does nothing without the UN or without the USA approving it. So you have this situation. Yes, they decided that those troops, those peacekeepers, are in their way. They're shameless in attacking them because they know they can get away with it. And essentially, from their perspective, they're kind of like the Frankenstein's monster. You know, it's a little bit out of control. It's embarrassing sometimes to the USA the way that the Zionists are so blatant. I think the Zionists themselves got used to a situation where there wasn't this live feedback mechanism for their crimes. They've been committing these types of atrocities for the whole of their existence, but they used to always get away with it because nobody really knew. And now it's embarrassing to the USA. You know, there's this thing. Sorry, you probably want me to stop talking, but just very quickly.
No, you're okay.
Benjamin Netanyahu has a practice of speaking in different ways in different languages. So he speaks in his most genocidal, blatant way in Hebrew to an Israeli audience, knowing very well that that won't reach the rest of the world. Yeah. The difficulty now is it is starting to reach the rest of the world. Even when he speaks in Hebrew, somebody puts it on TikTok and they put the captions underneath it for you. And lo and behold, a worldwide audience starts to realize, you know, the duplicity and the brazenness of the leaders of Israel and the arrogance with which they carry out their program, their colonial genocidal program, the blatant way in which they phrase it, which in the rest of the world has become unacceptable to say openly. Right? They're not really that different from the South African apartheid state or the Rhodesian one or the Kenyan one in their attitude to the natives. But it's just that for most of us, we have a sense that that's all in the past, that way of thinking about and talking about natives. And it's not really, you can't really do it anymore. The Israelis are still doing it. They know they have the USA at their back, but it's becoming increasingly clear to the rest of the world what the nature of Israel was, which used to be hidden from them, and now the mask has been lifted.
Yeah, there's so many great points. This is such a great conversation, especially the point, and I always try to catch myself because we know the history of Western genocide. Like, you guys know they killed 2 million Koreans. Like, what do you guys think that looks like? Like, when you see how they carpet bombed Cambodia to the Stone Age, what do you guys think that looks like? And the images and videos we're seeing out of Gaza, but it's horrific. But trust me, if there was social media, we would have seen the same thing out of Vietnam and Cambodia. What they have done to those people, what they have done to my people, what I mentioned before, the slaughterings, the torture and the lynching of African Americans. When you guys see the genocide of the Native Americans, what do you guys think it looks like? It's brutal. So that is such an important point that you make, and it's something that should be emphasized. And another point that you made, and my dear sister and friend Margaret Kimberly, Black Alliance for Peace, you mentioned how the UN should be dissolved, and I agree 100% because it's here to, as you mentioned, present the sham of international law, which has been replaced by quote unquote rules-based order. And you have people who was victims of quote unquote rules-based order in South Africa. Many of the legal team in South Africa grew up under apartheid, learned the system of their oppressor. This not the rules they made; it's the rules that the oppressor made. They learned the rules, mastered the rules and law, became judges, lawyers, and then they took Israel, a country who supported their apartheid, to court and found them guilty of committing genocide, and nothing is being done about it. And the response of, and I apologize, I forgot the name who said this, but it was a highly ranked official in Europe who said, how dare they? The International Criminal Court and the ICJ, they are for Africans and for Russians. And I was shocked when this quote came out, when they said, the rule of law, international law, is for the blacks and the Russians and the global poor, which reveals the entire structure. And that's one of the arguments people made when they say Hamas and the resistance essentially exposed the sham of international law. Now the world knows that international law is a sham, and the people who was brainwashed in the global stage are starting to wake up. Now, the last thing I want to bring up, I'm going to do like a slightly hard pivot for the last 5 or 10 minutes of this conversation. I want to get your thoughts on the conflict in Ukraine, on the context of this story. I have a hot spot on this topic coming out soon, so I'm not going to dive too much into it. I just found this hilarious. Once again, I'm covering this in my hot spot as well. How delusional Zelensky is. The absolute delusion of this man. This man, if he is not, and it's possible that he's just being a bad faith actor here. That's definitely possible, playing his role. But if it's not that, this man has had a full-fledged mental breakdown of delusion, because everyone knows the Ukraine war is over. Despite that, despite losing the entire generation of his people, Zelensky is like, I'm going to have this victory plan where you guys are going to allow me to join NATO. That's number one on the victory plan. Point number one, allow me to join NATO. But the position of the Biden administration has been, hey, homie, you're not. So explain to me how this makes sense, guys. How Zelensky has a victory plan where the number one bullet point of the victory plan that he proposed is him joining NATO. But NATO says it had to be Russia first, which completely nullifies the victory plan. But anyway, Joti, very broad as we get to the end of the stream. What's your thoughts over the Western obsession with going to war with Russia? We see it with China, with the Navy's 2027 plan. There's the headline. This is what I was referencing earlier. completely contradicts Zelensky's victory plan. I'll read the headline for people not watching the screen. Ukraine must win the war first before joining NATO. So what's the fucking point of this victory plan then? But Joti, I'll pass it to you. What's your thoughts on the aggression, I would call it Putin derangement syndrome, but not really. It's just Russia phobia. I guess it also chime in with the intense anti-China hate we've seen as well. What's your take and thoughts on that?
You know, of course, anybody who's paying attention can see there is no path for victory for Ukraine. The problem for the imperialists is, you know, Zelensky is a puppet. He's an actor. He's a stooge entirely. He has been highly rewarded for selling his country down the river, selling his countrymen into slavery and presiding over the massacre of a generation of his own countrymen. But he works for US imperialism. US imperialism wants to destroy Russia. In fact, the imperialist camp, the Western imperialists, need to destroy Russia for two reasons. Number one is their system is in a very deep crisis, and Russia represents a huge territory that they're not getting to loot in the way that they want to. And they feel if they could get back in there the way they got in there after the fall of the Soviet Union, and which the Putin's government, the national bourgeoisie put a stop to, the open, total, complete looting and enslavement and recolonization of Russia, they put a stop to that. The imperialists really need that to start again. They need this bonanza of looting to try to give a shot in the arm to their failing system and to try to revive their economies, which are deep and going deeper into a very, very, very serious crisis. So they're desperate to win. And the problem is, because they need it so badly, they can't take defeat when it's obvious, when it's staring them in the face. The way that they approach the question is, therefore, if we just keep it going, something might turn up. This is the mentality in every situation you see at the moment. If we can just keep it going, if we can keep the war going, if we can persuade people to keep sending weapons, if we can somehow find men to throw into the front line, if we can keep things going, it might be possible. Something might happen that swings things in our favor. Maybe we'll be able to create social unrest in Russia, and there'll be regime change, and we'll be able to, waltz in and take over. And what they really want is to balkanize Russia and loot it and colonize it and enslave it. But so really the way I see this whole victory plan thing is it's really a PR campaign to the decision makers to keep printing dollars and handing them over to the arms companies and keep sending dollars and weapons into Ukraine to somehow keep this thing going, even though more and more people are looking at it and going, really, shouldn't we just cut our losses? This is not working out. Shouldn't we just be pivoting to China at this point? So for me, that's what I see when I see stories like that.
Yeah, it was great having you on. It was very informative. I learned a lot myself, and I like that you stressed throughout the interview the fact that we should be constantly striving and reading more theory, because I want an intellectual working class, and I think there's been a coordinated effort. And I don't blame a lot of the proletariat. Some I do, to be honest. I blame some. I don't blame a lot of the proletariat for falling for the counter-revolutionary propaganda that is meant to dumb down the masses, because they want people dumb. They want people obsessing over celebrities. They want people just to be intellectually incurious. So I take it upon me as an educator to try to reach and help people who may be too busy. Like, for people who are listening to this at their job, there are a lot of people like we are a proletariat platform. Like, most of the people say, I'm listening on the job. Our job is to educate people who may be too busy to do that. But I do highly emphasize that, and I'm glad you emphasize that as well. And I'm still improving myself. I've only been a theory reading Marxist for about 3-4 years. And as I said to you guys before, it's a complicated science, and I'm constantly trying to improve. I am not perfect. I explained many times before. Most of the time I come on here and I'll just read some shit and I'll just explain what I read. So it sounds like I'm more well versed than I'm actually am, because I'll just talk about some shit I just read or whatever. But that's the journey that we all have, is to improve as revolutionaries and do everything we can to improve the status of the world, because we are a political optimists and we want to see the best for people. So anyway, Joti, last thoughts, anything you want to plug? Where can they find you and how can they support your work?
If you come to thecommunists.org, I think it might be down there actually.
Yeah,
thecommunists.org is my party's website. I personally have a Telegram channel, Joti Brar. You can see my name there, Jotibrar, Joti Brar. I have a Telegram channel that you can look at. My party has many, many pamphlets and books, lots of books by my father on all of the important topics. So if you go to our website and click on shop, you will see all of those for sale there. You can listen to some of them, some of our articles and even some of our pamphlets as recordings on Proletarian Radio, which is on SoundCloud, but I think it's on other platforms as well. You can watch many of our talks and speeches we've given on all kinds of topics on Proletarian TV, which is on YouTube, but it's also on Rumble and Odyssey. Yeah, there's a whole load of our stuff out there. I've written a couple of very small pamphlets. I'm not a great intellectual, but one is called The Drive to War Against Russia and China, which gives a kind of overview of what that's all about. It's very small, quite easy to read. And the other small pamphlet I've written, which just been published recently, is called Identity Politics or Class Politics, to explain to us the role that these divisive identity politics play in keeping us in silos where we fight and blame one another instead of uniting to fight the ruling class.
Yeah, they're plenty to check out. I'm definitely going to check out a few, and we definitely going to have you back to explain a lot of these theories. It was a very enjoyable conversation. So hopefully we can have you back on. Thank you for joining us, Joti. Make sure you guys check her out. And I appreciate you guys for watching. I think that's it for today. I'm gonna pop you in the background. Thank you for joining, Joti. Tomorrow the Sabby and JB show will be back. I will upload a full interview with System Update with Glenn Greenwald. So that will be coming as well. Next week, Post Duopoly returns with Due Dissonance, my friend Kit from Harlan's Meteor. So, we got even more bangers for you guys. Thank you guys for watching. Have a great rest of your day. Peace out, y'all.